Okay, good evening, good morning, everyone, wherever you are joining us from. And well, my name is Sagiya Lovegrove. For those who don't know me, I think that's not many in this group. And I'm here with Remco Vermeulen, and we're from the ICOMOS Netherlands committee. And we're part of a committee that organizes lectures around different heritage-related topics once a month. And we do this either in Amsterdam or online. And since, well, now that the pandemic is sort of, well, not entirely over, but the situation is a bit more stable, we're back doing some of the lectures in Amsterdam, but also we keep on doing some of the lectures online, because then we can also have evenings like this where we have speakers from many different places. Well, thank you for joining us tonight. And maybe, Remco, do you want to do what is the name in English? I forgot. The house rules? Not the house rules.
Yes, thank you, Sophia. Just very briefly from my end, so as you already heard from Sophia, we will be recording this online event so that we can after put it on the ICOMOS Netherlands YouTube channel so that people can watch it back. Also those who weren't able to join us today. Please keep yourself muted at all times. If you're not muted, then Sophia and I will mute you for we'll do that for you. So we will have time for questions during the event. There will also be a short break halfway so that you can get your cup of coffee or your drinks or have a toilet break. But if you have questions already during one of the lectures contributions, feel free to already ask your question in the chat, and I will get to that afterwards. I think that's it, Sophia. Maybe you can say something about the speakers and how we're going to do it.
Yes, I'll do that.
Perfect.
So I'll start by saying something about the topic of tonight. As the title of the event, Community-Centered Approaches to Heritage Management in Zimbabwe and South Africa. Involving and working with communities has become an important element quite some time now in the preservation, the management, the use, also the meaning making or meaning forming of cultural heritage sites. But how is this done in practice, and particularly in very diverse societies and post-colonial societies also? And what is the impact and what are the main challenges of such community-centered approaches to heritage management? These are questions that we would like to explore this evening, and to do that we have two speakers, one of whom unfortunately is probably not going to be able to join us, Munyaradzi. He called me just now to say that there have been really bad flash floods in Zimbabwe, and the connectivity, well, he doesn't have connectivity at all, so he said maybe there's a very small chance that things improve and I can join in the second part, but there's a very big chance that he won't join us tonight, which is really unfortunate. He has, however, sent me a pre-recording of his presentation, so that's really good. At least we can show that. And I've seen it already. It's really interesting, so it's definitely worth hanging on there to watch the presentation. We had a different speaker planned, Kobani Sipoyo from South Africa, and he informed me yesterday that due to emergency travels he was unable to join us. So it was quite an exciting process the last couple of days, trying to figure out what to do, also to try to find an alternative second speaker. And this morning I heard through Munyaradzi that he had contacted Ndukuyakhe, and he has agreed. He was also available to join us and to give a presentation about the South African context. It will be a different presentation, of course, than the one that Kobani was going to give, but I'm sure it will also be really interesting. So I'm, again, really happy that you managed to, you found the time to join in at such short notice. And I will very quickly share my screen to show let me see, I want to show very briefly the program, which has now been a little bit adapted. Let me see. See, can you see it? Yes. So we will start with a presentation by Ndukuyakhe Ndlovu from about the South African context. I don't have here a title because we didn't get that far to be able to set up a whole very complete program. Apologies for that. And then we'll have a short Q&A where you can already ask questions if you have them. And then we go for a short break. And then we will show the presentation from Munyaradzi, unless he miraculously manages to join. And then he will do that in person and live. But otherwise, we'll show the presentation, the recording, and then we can have a discussion afterwards, a longer discussion with everyone. And I will first start by, let me see, stop sharing. I will start by saying something about Dr. Ndukuyakhe Ndlovu is a PhD graduate from Newcastle University in the United Kingdom, and he's currently employed as an archaeology manager at the South African National Parks. He was most recently a senior lecturer of archaeology at the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology, at the University of Pretoria. And prior to that, he was manager of archaeological collections for the University of Witwatersrand. And his research focuses on Southern African rock art, heritage resources management, and transformation in archaeology. And he was for over 20 years, and he has over 20 years experience in heritage management in South Africa, having worked for both national and provincial heritage authorities in different capacities. So thank you again for joining us, Ndukuyakhe, and the floor is yours for your presentation. Oh, we can't hear you. You need to unmute. Yes.
Sorry.
Perfect.
Technology. but thank you for the opportunity to partake in this discussion today. Broadly speaking, I think when you're talking about management of heritage resources in South Africa, you cannot discuss it outside the legal context. The legal context has to be, right in the middle of your discussion. So let me paint a picture.
Sorry, Ndukuyakhe, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I'm sorry. I was wondering maybe if you can talk a little bit closer to the iPad, because I find it a little bit hard to hear, and maybe I see some people nodding, so maybe because it's a little bit muffled, the sound.
Okay, I just wanted to check my sound. Is it better now?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. I think just to reflect back on what I just said, when you discuss the management of cultural heritage in the South African context, you cannot do so outside, having a thorough reflection on the legislative framework. And to begin by, just painting that particular picture, I think it is important that I make people aware that South African legislation in South Africa, South African heritage legislation dates back to 1911. That's the first time that we had, legislation that was passed in the country. And specifically, that legislation was for one type of cultural heritage, and that was the Bushman heritage. And that is why it was called the Bushman Relics Act. But it soon became evident that that legislation was not protective enough of all other types of cultural heritage. And that is why it had to be amended a few years later. So without going through all the different pieces of legislation that have been passed in South Africa from 1911 to 1923 to 1934 to 1937 to 1969, in any level of detail, allow me to focus my attention on two legislation in particular. So this is going to be the 1969 legislation, as well as the current law that we apply in the South African context, which is the National Heritage Resources Act that was passed in 1999 and became effective in April 2000. Now, the 1969 legislation was the National Monuments Act. And that legislation was in use up until it got repealed in 1999. And it is a legislation that, in my view, was very much similar to the other pieces of legislation in terms of the language and in terms of the necessity of the legislation. What do I mean by language? The language was very much a language that says we have experts, particularly in a government context, and these experts are the ones who are going to be managing, what they define as of importance, cultural, in terms of cultural heritage. And two, there was no broader role, especially for a certain sector of the South African population. And specifically, I'm talking about the African people. They had no voice in terms of what heritage was and what types of heritage, were to be protected. I've argued before that in instances where what can be defined as African heritage found itself under protection, it was by interest of those who were in government at the time. So you look at the Bushman Relics Act, you could say, that act was purely about African heritage because it was protecting rock art in particular. But I would say that was out of curiosity more than out of a dire need to really take care of this, cultural heritage. It was out of curiosity because a lot of, people who had come to this part of the world were that curiosity in terms of the paintings that had been made by Bushman. Now, therefore, when you consider the language, that it was a language of an expert who has decided how heritage should be protected, and in addition to that, a framework where the greatest portion of the South African population had no voice, you can therefore tell that only a very selective type of cultural heritage was significantly looked after. And that is why if you look at the 1969 Act, for example, you will see that a lot of historical buildings with, I would say colonial, history to them, found themselves declared as colonial, not colonial monuments, but as national, what was called national monuments in the legislation at the time. You would then struggle if you go through the list of national monuments that were passed, even before 1969, to find, buildings that will talk of an African heritage, because most of the buildings there were very much colonial buildings, therefore very much colonial heritage. But also it makes sense because the people who were in charge in terms of the government entities were also people with colonial history attached to their origins. But what happens, therefore, is that when you make a transition in 1999, you are making a transition under a different, governance system. You are now making a transition under, a democratic era that began in 1994. So now there was this desire to say, let us transform not just the politics of the country, not just the economic system of the country, but also the management of cultural heritage resources in the country. And as part of doing that, it became necessary to amend the 1969 Act, and that is why we have the National Heritage Resources Act of 1999. But now here is the big argument that will be the foundation to a number of points that I want to highlight in general. I have argued that for me, there is absolutely not much difference between the 1999 Heritage Act and even the 1969 Act. And we can even go further and say, together with all the other pieces of legislation we have had in a country before. Let's look at the language. The language is still very much the same kind of language. Now, the only difference, linguistically speaking, is that you start seeing a legislation that does make reference to the need for consultation. And I'm talking about a much broader consultation here. This legislation then says we need to manage heritage at different levels. So we've got the national level, we've got the provincial level, and we've got the local level. Now, having spoken to people who were very much involved in the drafting of this legislation to large extent, one of the reasons they have given for this differentiation in terms of the national, provincial, and local was that heritage had to be managed by people, and even at their local level. What was important to them at the local level, they had to play a role and be active participants. So that's part of the foundation why we've got this three-tier system that is failing this by the way, but I'm not going to focus on that for now. So that's the change of a language in the law to now promote this idea that we are now being consultative. You also find a word, like people should be involved. We should consult with people whenever we make decisions of a heritage nature in terms of what happens with the cultural resources that might be of importance to them. So yes, you have that change in the language. So you could say we have seen significant transformation, but I argue to the contrary, because I have argued that while you see that change in terms of the language, it is not good enough. And here is the reason why it is not good enough. You do not invite me to a house, and the house that has been red all along, and then after 94, you paint it white, and you say, you see, I've changed the color of the house because I'm transforming this house, and I'm now inviting you to the house. The house architecture has not changed to accommodate me. The house architecture is still exactly as it was, before you painted it. And how I want my house to be, whether I want it to be round or whether I want it to only have one, large section, I have no role to say anything there, because all I'm going to say is I've now been invited into the house. I'm now a participant inside the house to whatever is happening inside the house. So yes, the African population is now part of the equation, because you could say they are included in the legislation, but their ideology is not being considered, because the ideology is still very much Western. What do I mean by that? The African spirituality that defines the management of cultural heritage sites is actually not allowed by the legislation because of the language that is used. You can go to section 35 of the legislation. It clearly says you cannot do this, you cannot do that, you cannot do this and that and that and that unless you have a permit. Now, that is the very nature of managing cultural resources. That is not being allowed by law, unless those who make approval give you a permit. And they will not give you a permit because that which you will do is going to deface, according to them, is going to vandalize, according to them, the cultural heritage that you say you are protecting. So if I go to a rock art site and there are ritual ceremonies, activities that have to be performed, I will be told I cannot dance, because when you dance inside the site, you are creating dust and it's going to cause art to fade. You cannot sprinkle anything during the ceremony because it's going to damage the rock art. So effectively, you have invited me, as I said, into this house, but I have no voice in this house. My ideology has got no role to play. I just have to tick the box that I also attended to the meeting. You look at section 36, even. It talks about the so-called human remains. So I've argued in my previous publication that even that language is a problem. We cannot be talking about human remains in African context. It's a language that does not exist. And yet, archaeologically, that's a language that is favored. Let's put that aside. There's a differentiation in terms of how a grave that is less than 60 years and a grave that is more than 60 years is managed in the legislation. But in an African ideology, there is no such separation. So yet again, I'm saying the language that we are using in the legislation has not transformed to the extent where we could say the African community is now actively part of the deliberations and they've got an active voice in determining what happens with the cultural heritage that we have in the country.
I think there's a connectivity problem. Ndukuyakhe, do you still hear us? Or hear me in this case? Going to, apologies for that. We'll just double check if he can join us again. It was quite at a crucial moment that connectivity was lost. Okay, I think he's probably trying. Sorry?
So there's no such thing as a coincidence.
I think he's probably trying to log in again. Give it a couple of minutes. I do hope he will manage to join again, because I have lots of questions about the present, well, about what Ndukuyakhe was saying right now about the tensions within heritage management in South Africa. Keeping my fingers crossed. I know, I mean, I don't want to be putting anyone on the spotlight here, but I was just wondering for anyone who maybe knows the South African context. Oh yeah, he's just messaged to say he got cut off. So that's a good sign if he got my message. Hopefully he can join again. I was just wondering for those who are here who know the South African context a bit, if what Ndukuyakhe was saying about the tensions within, oh yeah, I think he's joining us again. Let's see.
Mute yourself again, Nick.
Sorry?
Mute yourself again, Nicholas.
Yeah. I wasn't looking at you, Nicholas. Yes, I was. I just admitted him again, but I don't see him popping up. Do you see him, Remco? Oh, I see.
My apologies. I got cut off.
No
can you hear me?
problem. Yes, we can hear you. Yes, and no problems at all. It happens.
If I could just move towards, yeah. If I could just move towards my concluding remarks, I was saying, having moved from that, context where that legislation has changed. The gist. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, there was a little bit. It wasn't very clear, but I think now we can hear you properly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just give it another call. So, having moved from the context where I was saying legislation has changed over time, but maybe still remained the same. Having argued that some of the weddings have been included in the new legislation. But the argument I'm making is the more things are supposedly changing, the more they remain the same. Because public participation, but I'm participating at your own terms, not at my own terms. In fact, I've even said that should not be called, public participation, or even public consultation. Because if you are consulting with me, you are going to hear my opinion. And once you've heard my opinion, you might be convinced to think otherwise. But you cannot be convinced to think otherwise, because when I tell you that this is how I'm going to perform this ritual ceremony, you are going to tell me, no, but it's against the law, because you cannot do this. But law derived from where? From what ideology? So the ideology is still very Eurocentric, as it has always been over the years. And now this is exactly why, we have a situation in the country where, for some people to continuously perform their ritual activities, they must do so away, because if they follow the legal principles, they are always going to be told you are breaking the law. You're breaking Section 35. You are breaking Section 36. You know, and so on and so on. So that is a very big area of concern. Now, going forward, therefore, my argument is social consultation, has not led to a meaningful, situation where people can honestly say their voice is being, taken into consideration. So, in my view, nothing has changed altogether over the years, and that is at the core of the problem that I see, with the general management of cultural heritage in the country. That it is still very much dominated by the formal processes, where there are government entities that are tasked with managing heritage resources at whatever levels of the responsibility. But actually, the African voice participation in that. Let me just give another example to.
Ndukuyakhe, we are losing you.
Is okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Could you maybe just repeat the last sentence? I think that's when we lost you.
No problem. I was just wanting to give an example with Section 38. And now I'll briefly explain for those who don't know what the Section 38 is about. Whenever there is a development project in the country and heritage legislation is triggered, Section 38 comes into effect. So let us say, for argument's sake, some graves are discovered in this proposed housing complex or even a shopping development. There is a higher chance that someone who is going to be concerned about the traffic that's going to be caused by the new development, or the dust that's going to be an issue during the construction phase, or the noise that's going to happen over time, or even the visual impact that might occur as a result, they've got a better chance of being listened to in terms of what their opinions are, whether for or against that proposed development. And yet, knowing very well that South Africa has got a history of forced removals, whoever may have been removed there and have got their family graves there have no role to play at the very beginning, none whatsoever. A consultant will come, undertake a heritage impact study, confirm that there are 35 graves, and say the graves can be removed, you just need a permit. And then the whole process will go up until what we call a record of decision is issued to say the development can go ahead, but on condition that we remove those 36 graves. Now, that is only when people start now to trace the families who are linked to those particular individuals buried there. Now, by the time those people are consulted, it is way down the process. In fact, the language that's going to be used is, we have these graves that must be removed because otherwise they will be destroyed by the development. So you're consulting with me. You are coming to instruct me to say, either I accept and I sign that these graves are going to be removed, and I don't carry the cost as a family representative, but the company will take care of everything. And therefore they present themselves as being good citizens in that process. So by that time, my hands are tied. I cannot say I do not take it as part of our family traditions that we can disturb people who are sleeping peacefully. and repairing them somewhere. I don't have any possibility of challenging that anymore because a record of decision has been issued. All the other legal boxes have been ticked. This is the only one. So you see, therefore, how many people under the heritage legislation gets forced to have their graves relocated against their wishes. Because who wants to see the graves of their ancestors being damaged with tractors, during construction? When maybe, even though I don't want to, I could have accepted that the grave is relocated, somewhere else. So I'm saying the legislation is there just to tick the box. But at the end of the day, cultural heritage management is still very much foreign managed in this country. I think let me end there for now.
Thank you so much, Ndukuyakhe, for this very thought-provoking presentation, for sharing your views about heritage management in South Africa. If anyone has questions, I think it's fine if you just unmute yourself and ask them directly. We're in a small group, so I think that would work fine. Or you can also alternatively put the questions in the chat, or raise your hands, and all these options are possible. And I was just in
the chats. Do you want to go to that first, or do you want to first ask your first question,
Sagiya? Thank you, Remco. I hadn't. I was distracted with the cat on my laptop.
Yeah.
Let's go to the question in the chat. Indeed.
Nicholas, do you want to ask it yourself, or shall I read it up for you?
Well, Remco, I read it fine, but you can read it.
Okay. Question is from Nicholas Clark. The 1999 NHRA refers to importance to a community and its strong or special association with a particular community or cultural group for social, cultural, or spiritual reasons as a criterion for valuing of potential heritage national states. Do we have tools or methods in South Africa to be able to know where and why places are of importance to the diverse South African community?
Can I jump in?
Yes,
please do.
For me, the first problem we have is to try and look for heritage that is palatable to everyone, because we are a country. And that is what leads to the generalization of heritage. And I think that's a problem as a concept by itself. What is heritage to group 1 is not necessarily heritage to group 2. Therefore, when you want to benchmark, the tools will actually force you to benchmark and say, here's the benchmark for how we decide that site A is more important over site B. And once you do that, trying to universalize, it's a problem. So for me, I think each and every group that says this is important to us, that is how we should take it forward. That this is an important site to this kind of community, and not have any benchmark that says, here are the tools. Does it tick this box? Maybe yes. Does it tick this box? Does it tick criteria 1, criteria 2, criteria 3, criteria 4? And if you say, no, it only ticks 1 criteria, then say, no, it doesn't have the significance that we want to allocate to it so that we can manage it as a site of importance. So I think that's the problem that we have. By using tools, you are forced to have a benchmark. And by having a benchmark, you are forced to use the dominant voice to determine what is a benchmark. So for me, I am moving more towards a situation that says, whatever heritage site is important to any group, let it be. If over time, the site loses that importance, let it be. Culture is not static. Culture is changing over time. So a site that was important, 30 years ago, that might not be important now. Let it be. That's just how things evolve over time.
Thank you. I think that was quite a clear answer. I'm not sure, Nicholas, if you have any follow-up questions or.
Yes, if I may.
Of course, yeah. Go ahead.
I was actually curious about how we let communities, not whether we have tools to be able to, whether we have tools to grade and decide whether things become provincial or national or local heritage resources, but whether we have the methods and the tools to allow communities to speak. That's the question. That's really what I would like to know, whether we have the tools to be able to empower communities to know what the Act potentially allows them to do.
Okay, I hear you, but I would actually say that as I alluded to earlier on, the Act actually impedes community participation. The Act talks of community participation, but it actually impedes it. That's why I was using an example of a house that was read, and I get invited into the house, and once I'm invited in to accommodate me, the house gets painted white. The house is still the same house. Nothing has changed architecturally or anything. So I was using that to say the legislation impedes, because you can't invite me and say I have a right to an opinion in this legislation. And when I tell you that this is how I want to practice my rituals, because that is how we have always been doing it at this side, and then you read me section 34, section 35, and you tell me according to section 35, you cannot do this. So my participation is there to just tick a box to say you consulted with me, but actually I'm not allowed to participate, because whatever I say, you are going to educate me either and say this is wrong. So that's the problem I have with the legislation. In fact, it reminds me of an old title I used for a publication. I said, old archaeology camouflaged as new and inclusive. So the legislation that we have promotes the so-called new and inclusive archaeology, but it's actually old archaeology. The building is old, it's just nicely painted. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. I think you touched on a lot of points that I've been also thinking a lot about, this idea of national heritage. I mean, nations are so diverse. How can there be heritage sites that are important to everyone in the country, and who defines that? And I think this is really a question that a lot of countries with national heritage legislation are grappling with at the moment. And how do you make sure that different groups are also represented in what we call national heritage, and who gets to decide on what is considered of national importance? And I had a question as well about, I will just first say that Nanette de Jong added in the chat that on Sint Eustatius, there's a similar case with a burial ground called Golden Rock, where international standards or legislation is not appropriate according to the African descendants community there. That's a very interesting case that has been on the media, I think it was this year or last year. I don't know, Nanette, if you would like to add something to that, or you just wanted to share that in the chat.
Yes, it's still it's still a situation that everybody's talking about in Sint Eustatius. Mm-hmm. And I think it's quite interesting that it's in a lot of countries where so there are international standards, but they were made from a Western point of view, where you can just remove the people who are buried. But according to, from what I learned at this Golden Rock excavation, the African descendants community says, you know, those people are part of our daily life and we do not want them to be removed. So there's still a debate on Sint Eustatius about how to go about, but all the voices are heard. But what to do, that's also the question. So, but I think it's good to know that it's a case in a lot of countries where this is debated.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just
so we should do something about the international standards, maybe.
Yeah. Or decolonize heritage management.
Yeah,
I'm joking. I won't use that term. I know that term has been used and abused. I think that's a very, and also standards that have become national standards after colonialism, but that don't really apply to the local context. I think that was also what Ndukuyakhe, you were arguing, that a lot of the legislation that was set in place was from the colonial period, or in this case, the apartheid period, and that doesn't really suit the South African context. Did I understand that's correct? Yeah.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think just for the sake of timekeeping, I suggest that we take a 5-minute break, just so that we also don't run over time. And then we come back to, I'm afraid, watch the recording instead of listening to Munyaradzi in person, but we'll be watching his recording. And then I think his presentation will also tie into a lot of things that you have been discussing now, and Ndukuyakhe. So I think it will be, then we can maybe further discuss the South African case, since Munyaradzi isn't here, and maybe pick on some of the things that he mentions in his presentation. So I suggest that we meet again in 5 minutes. Okay, perfect. To get a glass of water or go to the bathroom or whatever is necessary. And we'll see you again in 5 minutes then. Welcome back after the break. We'll go directly to Munyaradzi's presentation. It will, as I said, unfortunately, will be a recording, but still, I hope it will be really interesting to listen to anyway. Just a short introduction. Munyaradzi Elton Sagiya has a PhD in Cultural Heritage Management, and he's a lecturer in the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at Bindura University of Science Education in Zimbabwe. Prior to his current employment at the university, he was a curator of archaeology and head of research and conservation department for over 10 years at the Great Zimbabwe World Heritage Site, located in the south of Zimbabwe. And amongst many of his duties, he was responsible for developing and advising on policy relating to the involvement of different publics in the management of Great Zimbabwe and other heritage sites in the country. So without further ado, Remco, would you like to share the presentation?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending with where you're tuning in from. I'm going to present this lecture entitled Giving Back, Engaging and Empowering Communities at Heritage Sites in Zimbabwe. I will start with a personal note, then provide a brief historical background to heritage management before I present the thrust of this lecture. So I grew up in a rural community situated about 3 kilometers southwest of the Great Zimbabwe, and I belong to Nemanwa clan, one of the groups that have a long history of contestation over the custodianship of this premier monument. Growing up in the shadows of Great Zimbabwe's massive stone walls, the site became a familiar viewscape for me. I grew up listening to elders during clan meetings or other social village gatherings where oral tradition and narratives about Great Zimbabwe would evoke ancestral stories, leading to long discussions and arguments. It is largely against this background that I was influenced to study archaeology at university. My goal was to understand Great Zimbabwe by combining the indigenous and academic knowledge of the site. Fortunately, in 2009, upon completion of my studies, I was employed by the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe, the agents in charge of the administration of heritage sites in Zimbabwe, and I was based at Great Zimbabwe, where I was a curator of archaeology. I worked at this site from 2010 until mid last year when I joined the university, where I'm currently teaching culture and heritage studies. So I've got a living experience of this topic that we are discussing today. In terms of the history of heritage management in Zimbabwe, there is a very long history that can be traced from the pre-colonial era, where you'd find that most heritage places in Zimbabwe as well as in African countries, they are regarded as sacred. As such, prior to colonization, these places were protected through various taboos and restrictions. More so, these places had custodians in form of elders, spirit mediums, and many other unwritten laws were used to regulate and manage these heritage places. The mere fact that the early Europeans to visit Zimbabwe found a number of these heritage sites intact is a testimony to some form of heritage management that was in existence. The Western ways of looking after heritage were then introduced during the colonial era, and for Zimbabwe, this is the period that stretches from 1890 to 1980. And Zimbabwe had interesting twists and turns in terms of colonialism, where initially the country was occupied by the British South Africa Company, a company that was owned by Sisulu John Rhodes, who is the one who also named the colony after himself. So the country was named Rhodesia after Rhodes. Then around 1920s, it became directly a colony of Britain. Then in the 1960s, the white settler government decided to declare what became known as the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, something that frustrated the empire, UK, and this led to the sanctioning of this government. However, in these different colonial governments, heritage, in particular, the site of Great Zimbabwe, took a center stage. It's a site that was embedded in the colonial agenda and colonial propaganda. Firstly, sponsored by Sisulu John Rhodes, who argued that and was of the view that Great Zimbabwe is a site that had been built by non-Africans, by Phoenicians, Arabs, and many other foreigners who were attributed to be the authors of this civilization. This was a critical fact for Rhodes, because if this civilization was or belonged to foreigners, it therefore discredited the claims of land by the local inhabitants, who probably were later occupants. And as a result of these theories, Great Zimbabwe and many other similar sites fell victim of antiquarianism as well as treasure hunting. And it was because of the international public outcry on the damage that was being inflicted on heritage sites that new approaches were developed to protect heritage in form of passing legal frameworks such as the Ordinance of 1902 and 1912, the Act of 1936, as well as the National Museums and Monuments Act of 1972. Definitely, colonialism had an impact in terms of heritage management, where firstly it introduced a foreign way of looking after heritage resources. And in this type of management, local communities were excluded from using their past, as well as determining how their past were to be preserved and managed. Most, if not all, heritage sites became state properties. They were fenced off. Later on, some were developed into tourist destinations, and an entrance fee being introduced, rituals were banned, amongst other foreign ways of developing and looking after heritage. It was during the post-colonial era, which stems from 1980, when local communities began to anticipate a new form of heritage management that was going to include and involve them in heritage management. And one of the key bold steps that were taken by the post-colonial government was to rename the country after a heritage site. So Zimbabwe is a name that is derived from Great Zimbabwe archaeological site. I will talk about this site in a few minutes. But there are two very interesting cases that took place during the early years of colonialism that I want to share with you. One is a case of a spirit medium who was known as Sophia Muchini, who soon after independence occupied the protected estate of Great Zimbabwe, where she built a homestead and she was performing different ritual activities within the site, leading to the complaints and frustration of the then heritage managers, and some of the crimes that she was alleged to be committed included mentioning that Africans were not supposed to pay entrance fee, amongst others listed on this slide. Then another example that I want to share with you of communities' reaction to independence happened at Lomboshava, a national monument located in northern Zimbabwe, where after being banned to conduct rituals, local communities decided to splash the impressive rock paintings with oil paint. A curio shop that had been constructed was also painted. That was in the early 1990s. And the statement of the communities was that if they could not benefit from the site spiritually or economically, then even the heritage managers and the national museums and monuments of Zimbabwe either could also not benefit. And as such, against this background, I want to present some of the strategies and ways in which the national museums and monuments of Zimbabwe have adopted as ways of empowering and engaging local communities. I will begin with the site of Great Zimbabwe, which is a World Heritage Site and a national monument under the custodianship of the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe, an organization that falls under the Ministry of Home Affairs and Cultural Heritage. Great Zimbabwe is surrounded by 4 historic communities, namely the Mugabe, the Nemanwa, Murinye, and Charumbira. And these communities, prior to colonization, they were settled within the estate. They were actually evicted out of the estate during the colonial era. And over the years, they've settled just immediate to the boundaries of this site. And now the national museums, after realizing that it is important to involve communities in heritage management, they've come up with different ways of engaging this complex local community in terms of managing the site. One of the profound and long run project is the Shona Village, which is a theme park where local communities perform different activities, which include demonstration of pottery making. There is also a traditional healer. There are 2 music performing groups that entertains tourists, and this village provides an opportunity for local communities to generate income from tourism. And I just want to show the setup of the Shona village through this short video. As you can see, these are women from the local communities who are selling different crafts. And this theme park is located central to Great Zimbabwe, where almost every visitor to the site gets an opportunity to visit the Shona village. The other important approach in which the National Museums is also engaging the local communities is through the establishment of the Great Zimbabwe Local Community Management Committee, which was established in 2010. This committee is constituted by representatives of the surrounding chiefdoms, and in principle, the committee meets the heritage management team at Great Zimbabwe on a monthly basis to discuss areas of mutual interest between the legal heritage custodian and them. And some of the issues that they discuss revolves around community sharing of the proceeds from the site, among other critical aspects relating to the conservation and management of this monument. And one important event took place in 2013 when two members of this committee participated in a workshop that was organized by different intergovernmental heritage organizations to train people about risk preparedness. And the participation of members from this community enhanced their sense of belonging and also how seriously they are considered in the management of the site. Through this committee, a school fees assistance program was introduced at Great Zimbabwe, and so far about 200 learners from the local communities have benefited from this scheme, which pays school fees as well as examination fees for those who are sitting for their national examinations. At Great Zimbabwe, there is an unwritten policy that gives preference to local community in terms of employment. And as such, the majority of the employees currently at Great Zimbabwe are from the local communities. And this is one of the ways of empowering the locals. The site of Great Zimbabwe is also regarded as sacred, and as such it is revered by the local communities. And as a way of engaging the communities, the National Museums have devised ways of accessing the site for rituals, ceremonies, and other cultural practices. So these are just a few examples of activities of engaging and empowering communities around Great Zimbabwe. I want to share other activities happening elsewhere at sites such as Ziwa, which is located in eastern Zimbabwe. It is a cultural landscape that covers a vast piece of land, about 800 square kilometers. And National Museums for long had been having difficulties with local communities who have always been coming into this estate, cutting down trees for firewood and other activities. And in turn, the organization decided to come up with a beekeeping project where local communities were trained on how to build beehives and the mounting of beehives. And as a result, local communities from Ziwa have been producing honey for consumption as well as local markets, something that has also empowered them. At other sites, the National Museums have also introduced a program known as Adopt a Site approach, where schools, local communities, after going through an educational exercise, they become custodians of their heritage sites. the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe become a supervisor to different activities. And this approach has taken place at key important heritage sites such as Chibumani, where a primary school is currently taking charge of the site. There are also proposals from the Great Zimbabwe University to adopt another important heritage site known as Kubiku. My university is also in the process of adopting 2 national monuments located near our institution. And this is one of the ways in which National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe feels is the best way of managing heritage through different communities and stakeholders. Merumedzo is another interesting heritage site where the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe have worked with local communities in terms of protecting this sacred place that is revered by the local communities, and it's associated with edible insects known as sting bugs. And over the years, the site had been experiencing some challenges in terms of settlement encroachment, cutting down of trees, which resulted to the National Museums working together with local leadership to gazette this place as a national monument, which now means that it is now legally protected. Matendera is another heritage site located in eastern Zimbabwe, where a cultural festival has been introduced as a way of engaging and empowering communities to participate in the presentation and management of their heritage. So these are just a few examples of how the heritage managing institutions in Zimbabwe are engaging different communities in looking after heritage places. But these examples that I've presented have been implemented with some challenges, with some difficulties, mainly because they are different communities with multiple interests, which at times conflicts with those of heritage managers. One of the local leaders at Great Zimbabwe once denounced being invited to the site under the banner of a stakeholder. He argued that as traditional leaders, they are not stakeholders. In fact, they are the owners of heritage. So whenever they are being invited to a workshop or to any event, they should be regarded as the owners of heritage, who should play a critical role in the management of heritage. Another element that makes involving communities in heritage management difficult in the context of Zimbabwe is that currently there is no legal framework that supports the management of heritage in partnership with local communities. In fact, Zimbabwe is still using a heritage law that was adopted during the colonial era. And though we are in the process of revising, rectifying this act, the current act is silent about how to involve communities, how communities can be empowered, and so on and so forth. So these issues present challenges in terms of the effective engagement or empowering of local communities at heritage sites. As I conclude this presentation, one of the major challenging aspect is to determine when involving communities should begin or end as part of the process of looking after heritage sites. But what is critical to highlight is that the management of heritage in cooperation with local communities is not an event, but it's a process that evolves through time. What is critical is that involvement of local communities, empowerment of local communities should be context-based. There is need to look at the local situation to determine what approaches to use or what approaches are not ideal for a particular heritage site and its local communities. It is always difficult to reconcile interest of local communities with those of heritage managers or with those of professional heritage management. But whatever the case, I believe that the cases, examples that I have presented emphasize that in all heritage management programs, we need to involve local communities, because coming up with programs of managing heritage without the involvement of the local communities is a recipe for disaster. On that note, I thank you. I want to express my sincere gratitude to the organizers of this lecture, as well as Sophia, who have been very helpful in terms of engaging me in preparation of this lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Remco, for for sharing the screen and the presentation. And if Munyaradzi would be here, I would say thank you so much for this really rich presentation. I really got a sense that I learned a lot about heritage management and the challenges of community participation in Zimbabwe. I would like to ask maybe Ndukuyakhe if you would like to comment perhaps on Munyaradzi's presentation. I think there are quite a lot of parallels between both your presentations in terms of the challenges of dealing with colonial era heritage legislation or the afterlives of this legislation today, and the challenges of also making sure the communities also have a voice to engage in the heritage management of sites that are relevant to them and in ways that are relevant to them. So I was wondering if you would like to say something about the presentation, or raise a question or for the discussion.
Yeah, just a few quick remarks. I think the first point that would have been evident is that even though I didn't discuss the legislation in South Africa in any detail, but some of the legislation he referred to, except the 1902, were legislations that were passed in South Africa, but applied in what was Rhodesia as well, because Britain obviously had a large number of colonies in Southern Africa. And there was a tendency that if you pass a legislation in South Africa, you apply it in all your other colonies as well. So that's just one point to mention, so that you can see the link between the different countries. Whereas the Portuguese, which had Angola and Mozambique, treated this as separate entities in a way, unlike the British, who, equated all their colonies, as far as heritage legislation is concerned. But also this case study that he used, the Domboshava, I should emphasize, like he did as well, that this is an incident that happened after the transition of 1980. So here you haven't got an African government that should understand very well, what African ideology is all about. And yet the very same government uses the Eurocentric language of physicality and says, you are going to destroy the integrity of the site if you allow people to continue practicing rainmaking ceremonies at the site. And therefore, they had to close that natural chimney that people were using. And in anger, people retaliated by painting over that rock art to say, if we cannot enjoy access to the site, you're not going to enjoy access to the site as well, in your own terms. So that happens after the transition. And here's another interesting element, though. Zimbabwe has been, let's call it a free country from, let's say, late 79, 80. And yet, even to this day, they're still using the 1972 legislation. Now, you ask yourself a question. If African governments really wanted to transform things post-independence, how come a country like Zimbabwe, named after one of the most well-known archaeological sites, that was, as he alluded at the beginning, was politically not considered to be of African origin, and yet the very same country is still using highly colonial legislation of 1972. Now, let me disappoint you by saying as well, I've been involved in discussions on the new legislation in Zimbabwe. I was participating in those discussions in February and March this year. And one of the comments I made was that I feel like my Zimbabwean colleagues are still very much attached, to colonial language, in terms of the language that is also used in the draft legislation that I have had the privilege of going through in very much detail. So, these are all the problems. But let me conclude by saying one thing that has become a lot more evident for me in the publication that I've been working on over the past 2 years. And that is, if there are two common elements in all the countries of Southern Africa at transition from colonial rule to democratic rule. And that is the majority of the African leaders who took over the management of those countries were either from a royal family. This is definitely evident in Lesotho, in Zimbabwe, in Botswana, even, I would say, even in South Africa with Mandela. So they are either from royal, privilege, or they are highly educated in terms of the Western form of education. Now, attached to that, they got highly educated because of Christianity. A large majority of them came from, a Christian foundation, which was very much based on the missionaries. You find that their parents were part of the missionaries. They grew up in missionaries themselves. They were educated by missionaries. And therefore, it is not surprising that someone who comes from that strong missionary background, is going to find it hard to see the need to transit, from, colonial thinking that is also dominated by Christianity to some extent, and promote African way of doing things. So I think this is why Southern African countries have struggled, because of the leaders that we have had who come from a very strong, missionary background, almost all of them, without going through them individually for sake of time. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for that commentary. And you mentioned also that you are working on a publication about this topic. I was wondering when we can expect to hear more about that. At least I got very intrigued.
Well, if the editors, if the editor of the book series likes my book enough, I hope that it definitely does get published. But yes, it's for a book manuscript that I've just finished.
Wow. Okay. Great.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that it will be published soon.
I hope so too.
And I will now, I see that there is a question in the chat, and I wanted to mention that we will be sending the recording to Munya also, for him to be able to watch it back if he would like to. So if you have questions, you can ask them here, you can ask them in the chat. We will make sure to copy them and send them to him. I see that there's one suggestion in the chat, so we'll make sure to copy that and send it to Munyaradzi. And alternatively, I will also put his email here. He also shared it in the presentation, but I'm sharing it now in the chat. If you would like to contact him directly, he said that is also possible. But so do you, well, I'm now opening the floor to everyone here because we also don't have much more time left, but I was wondering if anyone would like to ask any questions to Munyaradzi or to Ndukuyakhe, or comments before we.
Sophia, Kees
Hi, Kees.
Hello. I was wondering what would be the way forward to change this, not only the laws, but this whole understanding on what heritage is and what it means to communities, because it seems to be stuck now in what would be a chance to change it or to get some movement in it, besides publishing an important book.
I think that question is for you, Ndukuyakhe, and I will also invite also Munyaradzi to react to it if you'd like to.
Well, just a very quick comment. I've thought a lot about this, and my ideas have changed over time as well. In the very beginning, I had this optimistic, view that what I say is a real, a really transformed form of community participation can actually happen. But over time, and I'm thinking here specifically when I did my master's project, that was very much an idea that I still hope, is achievable. But over time, I've begun to think, like I said earlier, that I think what we need is a situation whereby we have no benchmarking in terms of what is of national importance, what is of regional importance, what is of semi-regional importance in terms of the local level. We should have no benchmarking. If any site is important, for whatever reason, and there is no community interest that is active, yes, we consider that as a site that we know something about because archaeologists have excavated, they've told us so much about, or because paleontologists have discovered it and they've said so much about, then it's a site of importance. But if there's a site that is still of importance to particular sets of communities for ritual purposes, that we do not come with a benchmark that says you can only do it this way and not this way, but we allow communities to, to manage those sites the way they seem fit. In my one publication last year, I argued that we always get told we are managing heritage for future generations. And I used the example of Lascaux, in France. And I say that site has been closed to the public for many years, decades, in fact. Now, since they've closed that site, the level of destruction has increased. The microclimate of the site has changed. I'm living today, many years later. Am I not the generation they were talking about? That I'm still not allowed to go to the original Lascaux. I've got to go to Lascaux 1. I've got to go to, Lascaux 4 now that they've opened. So this idea that we are going to prevent people from using heritage today on their own terms because we are doing it for future generations. Which are these future generations when 2 generations later, I'm still not allowed to go to a particular site? So I think if a site gets, in your view, destroyed, it is what it is. Heritage is not meant to be permanent. Let us not stop fossilizing heritage. Heritage is not, static. It changes. The views on heritage are not static. They change. So fossilizing heritage is what we have promoted, and I'm against that idea. Thank you.
So I guess the way forward is no benchmarking anymore. Let's abolish that idea. I see that, well, to put it a bit too simplistic, of course, but I see that Nicholas has raised his hand. Go ahead, Nicholas.
Yes, I like this idea very much of not benchmarking heritage anymore. But at what point does heritage become non-heritage, or at what point does everything then become heritage? Does heritage then still exist if there's no benchmarking or no label? Do we then still cherish things, or does it become free flow? I'm just curious how Dr. Ndlovu thinks about it.
Well, my view would be, if heritage site A is important today and it's important for the next 10 years or 20 years, let it be. You know, that is what it is to those particular people who are living today. If even when they are still living, the site loses importance because of generational issue that, you know, people are moving more towards whatever part of lifestyle, it's part of life, you know, then let it be, you know, because even a heritage site that we are protecting so much today, we are protecting so much because of the dominant voices. And those dominant voices are not always going to be there. I mean, just look at South Africa as an example. Even this applies even in Zimbabwe. ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe has been the political party in power since 1980. The same thing applies in South Africa with the ANC. We are fed the liberation heritage narrative of ANC. And even in this context of South Africa, we don't know much. We don't appreciate much of the ANC, IFP heritage. You know, we don't appreciate much of the PAC heritage, and the list goes on. Even in Zimbabwe, you know, Joshua ICOMOS and the likes are not given as much, you know, space. So this benchmarking and this fossilizing of heritage allows only the dominant to have a voice because they set, you know, everything up going forward. So for me, you know, we should just have that general flow. It's important today. It might not be important tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicholas, do you like to add anything, ask anything else?
Well, I think this is a very interesting perspective, and that it's the perspective of when heritage becomes mainstream, when heritage becomes something which is institutionalized. And the heritage movement in Western European context, in any case, was always, historically in any case, if we think of the movement to stop demolitions, for instance, in historic Amsterdam, or other Western European cities, the movement to try to stop post-war demolition of and reconstruction of areas, etc. Often the heritage movement was not the dominant voice, not the powers that be, but people coming in and opposing what was actually mainstream. So maybe the institutionalization of heritage is the challenge that we face, not so much the fact that we try to give things labels. This is just a thought that came up during the discussion.
Would you like to react, Ndukuyakhe?
Sorry, the South Africans are now taking over the discussion. Sorry about this.
Yeah, no, I mean, Munyaradzi is not here, so unfortunately, well, so yeah, I think that would be bound to happen. But would you like to comment, Ndukuyakhe? And no pressure. I mean, I know I'm putting a lot onto you, considering that you're the only speaker that is live with us. Otherwise, I also had a question that I think ties into these issues as well. Because you also mentioned that in South Africa, you have different levels of heritage. So you have the national, the provincial, and the local. And I think we just lost, that was probably maybe why he also didn't react. Let's maybe give it a second. Well, we're also running a bit out of time. Maybe he decided, okay, it's enough for me. I'm already over the time, so I'm going to go.
What he suggests, by the way, is also a bit moving from intangible more to tangible as the dominant heritage source, if I may say it that way. Intangible to tangible or the other way around? From intangible to tangible. Do I say it right? Yeah, because I always confuse those. Because when you say it must mean something to the people now. And if it doesn't mean anything more to the people now, then it's not heritage. So heritage in a sense, or it is not important anyway.
Yeah, I had to think a bit of the case of, in the Netherlands, we have the statue of Jan Pieterszoon Koen, who was, well...
I live in Jan Pieterszoon Koenstraat. No bad word about.
Well, for those who don't live in the Netherlands or don't know the Dutch context very well, he during the whole the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, and it's a lot of People always were protesting against the presence of statues that represent people that were, well, that did violent things during colonial times. And Jan Pieter Koen, of course, is very famous in the Netherlands for what he did in Indonesia, in the Banda Islands. And
infamous.
Infamous, exactly. That's a good correction. But I discovered recently that actually this statue in Hoorn, in a city in the Netherlands, is a national monument. So the statue is actually protected. Although I think there are many people that would be quite upset to know that that's the case if they don't know already. And this is, I think, a good example of maybe should we look at the legislation and undesignate this monument if it is or not. I mean, perhaps a contested monument also has a function, but just I had to think of that example. But I got a message from Ndukuyakhe that the load shedding has started, and that means he won't be able to connect anymore. So that's
He is in. Oh, I don't
sorry.
know if he.
Oh,
I see he's in, so I don't know if he can hear us.
He's maybe connecting in a different way. I hopefully not using. Ndukuyakhe, can you hear us? Let's see. Aha.
I can, although I'm battling with my poor cell phone network.
Oh, well, maybe, I mean, unless there are any more very urgent questions, because you can also email the ICOMOS email address if you have further questions. But I would suggest maybe, considering that we are already over the time, and because of the load shedding, then maybe we should end here now, unless there are any very urgent things that anyone would like to share, or also Ndukuyakhe, if you would like to just close off by saying anything else that you would like to share still this evening. I'm not sure if I guess he's connecting through a different way. Maybe this is not such a stable connection. I'm not sure if he can hear us now. And just
if we cannot thank him for his great contribution, I really want to at least thank you to this evening.
Exactly, but I have WhatsApp contact with him, and I'm just checking if he will.
Okay.
Okay, I think.
Oh yeah, he's now out of the Zoom as well.
Oh, that's a pity. Just wanted to at least.
Yeah.
Nesina Nets is thanking everyone for the very interesting topic and lectures. And I'm saying this out loud because we are recording it. So, and Ndukuyakhe, I see that you're back. Can you hear us? I can hear you, not very well, but I can hear that you're there.
Doesn't seem to.
No.
I think it's when it was 9, the connection flawed. So
exactly. No, he had let me know.
Sign.
Yeah, Ndukuyakhe had let me know, and I kind of I lost a bit track of time, but he had let me know that at 10 o'clock, I think 10 o'clock there or 9 o'clock in South Africa, 10 o'clock.
Yeah, correct. There's
yeah,
that they would. 1 hour.
Yeah, that the load shedding would start. So I should have kept that in mind and stopped a little bit earlier. Apologies for that. I will just say many thanks, Ndukuyakhe, for joining us. Anyway, I'll send in we can send in
much worse than my wife.
Oh, we just heard it. Well, in any case, many thanks to Ndukuyakhe for joining us at such a last minute and for being incredibly well prepared for someone who actually didn't have any time to prepare to be here with us this evening. So very impressive. And thank you also to Munyaradzi for preparing a really fascinating presentation well in advance, so we could share tonight, which I think was really good that we could still do that. And Ndukuyakhe, can you hear us? I think that's well, I think that's unfortunately it for this evening. Thank you everyone also for joining us and for your patience. Unfortunately not, I guess I also realized very much during the preparation of this event that having stable Wi-Fi is really is a privilege, and So let's be thankful for that, for those who have that, and well, for those who don't, that's really, really not, I can imagine that's a really big challenge. But in any case, I'm so happy with the flexibility of everyone. I can. Can you hear? Oh, can you hear us? No, I think.
Yes, I'm still here.
Wonderful. I don't know if you heard, but we just thank you so much for you being here, for your really amazing contribution to this discussion. And we are now rounding off. Well, we are now saying goodbye and closing off the events, because we're already a bit past the time, and also because I think for you it will be really difficult now to stay connected. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And I see that Dan mentioned in the chat that the next.
Thank you, Kipper.
Thank you so much, Ndukuyakhe, for joining us.
Thank you.
And
thank you,
yeah.
everyone.